Hi, welcome to our Language Access webinar. My name is Isela Arras, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs for the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we're going to spend the next hour or so discussing ideas for making services truly accessible and ways of being able to comply with the requirements to be language accessible. I was hired in 2002 to help the coalition ensure that its 15-member programs across the state would be able to provide services to immigrant families. And the natural first place to start was with language accessibility to make sure that we could communicate with people who were seeking our services out. So um, I hope throughout this webinar to be able to share a little bit of how that's worked for us, where we are, and where we continue to learn. I'm really excited to show you at the end of our webinar sort of an overview of where things stand today. Because as you can imagine, over the last 17 years, our programs have made quite an incredible have had quite an incredible journey in being able to say that they are truly making some strides toward being language accessible. Now, please know that language accessibility is not a destination, it's more of a journey. You know, sometimes some programs have different resources available to them or different needs, and it's not a linear process. So first of all, be kind to yourselves, be kind to your programs, and understand that it's not going to be a straight line. So we will go ahead and get started. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the background that establishes the need for language accessibility. Executive Order 13166, signed by President Bill Clinton, essentially told us that we, as federal fund recipients, needed to be able to be language accessible and provide meaningful access to services to people who were LEP, limited English proficiency. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act also tells us that we must ensure that our services are non-discriminatory. And the reason that that matters is because in terms of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, language is included as a part of national origin. So when we don't provide interpreters or we don't provide translation services or when we don't provide any kind of language accessibility to services, we are essentially discriminating on the basis of national origin. And as federal funds recipients, we have a responsibility. And believe it or not, there is actually some guiding documents, some guidance and language that actually helps us to be able to create a bit of a checklist to be able to say, are we meaningfully accessible? Are we in compliance, or are we being discriminatory? So before we get into what we can do with regard to meaningful access and with regard to being compliant and providing language accessible services, I really do want to spend a minute and talk about what exactly discrimination on the basis of national origin can mean. It's important to be able to identify the specific problem, because if we don't solve the right problem or understand the right problem or point out the right problem, then we are going to be solving the symptoms, and we won't have as much of an opportunity to be able to be as successful as we would like. So with regard to language accessibility, we can identify discrimination on the basis of national origins based on the following examples. We limit participation in a program or activity on the basis of English proficiency, or subjecting people to unreasonable delays in the delivery of services, or failing to inform LEP persons of the right to free interpreters, or requiring LEP persons to provide their own interpreter. It's also providing services that are more limited or lower in scope than those provided to other people. And please keep in mind that even though I talk about LEP people, this also applies to people who speak American Sign Language or who might require additional language assistance. So these four examples are pretty clear in what discrimination and what discriminatory activities can mean. So for example, I'll give you some examples of a couple of these. that show up pretty often in my work. Limiting participation in a program or activity on the basis of English proficiency can look perhaps like maybe we've identified that support groups are the best intervention for survivors of domestic violence to be able to obtain some of the benefit of being in community. However, if someone who only speaks Spanish is only ever provided one-on-one counseling and not provided an interpreter to participate in support groups, then that's an example of limiting participation in a program or activity. Subjecting LEP people to unreasonable delays in the delivery of services. I know that it's a common experience sometimes for bilingual staff who come back to leave for vacation or are out for the week, and they come back to many callers that can only be helped by that person. And that's an unreasonable delay in the delivery of services. It should not be that only one person can help someone on the basis of language. There's a variety of reasons for that, but if we need and we say we are trying to build capacity, then it's important to be able to build that capacity, including in areas where we are serving underserved populations. Number 3 and number 4, providing services that are more limited or lower in scope than those provided to other people. Again, those are pretty self-explanatory. So what are exactly the responsibilities of federal funds recipients? At the end of the day, that can be summed up by saying that our responsibility is to provide meaningful access. These 5 elements are described in the Federal Register, which includes the guidance from the Department of Justice to be able to tell us what does it mean to really provide meaningful access, non-discriminatory services to non-English speakers or to limited English proficient people. So meaningful access involves the following 5 elements. It involves notice. We need to tell people of the availability of language accessibility services, language services, interpreters, translators, or the ability to obtain them. It means we need to have multilingual materials. It means that we need to have skilled staff. We need to have periodic training and monitoring, and we need to have policies and procedures in place to be able to respond to the needs of non-English speakers or people who have some limited English proficiency. So what does notice mean? As we break all of these down so you can have multiple examples or start thinking about what it means to incorporate meaningful access and language accessibility initiatives into your own organization. This means we have brochures in multiple languages. This means things like I Speak cards. We developed cards that non-English speakers would receive that were English on one side and another language on the other side. And it told providers in our communities that they were also expected to provide language accessible services, because language accessibility is a requirement and non-discrimination is a requirement doesn't apply only to our member programs. That requirement also applies to our community organizations because they are also federally funded. So at the end of the day, this also applies to really just anyone who receives federal funding. One of the interesting things that comes up sometimes is, well, I don't receive federal funding, and am I required to do this? Sometimes this comes up with regard to doctors, but at the end of the day, it could mean that if a doctor's office, for example, accepts Medicaid, then that is federal funding. Or if they accept state funding, if they accept local funding, because it doesn't just apply to direct federal assistance or direct federal funding, it's also indirect. So, for example, the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence receives a $13 million contract from the Cabinet for Health and Family Services to provide domestic violence services to survivors. Well, we subcontract out that money to our 15 domestic violence programs. And by accepting those funds from the coalition, who accepts it from the state, who accepts federal funds, we are all required to become language accessible and to be non-discriminatory in our service delivery. So it became important for us to let our community partners know that they were equally responsible for doing the same thing that we were attempting to do through those I Speak cards. We require posters in visible places so that people are aware that they can request an interpreter should they need one or should they want one. We also have language that explicitly lets people know that services are available in multiple languages. Programs attend local community events and multidisciplinary meetings to be visible and inform that their services, inform providers, other providers, community partners, and allied professionals that their services are available in the community and that they are language accessible as well. All of these as examples constitute notice. Here's an example of what our poster looks like. This has become a required poster for our 15-member programs, and we include it in our monitoring process. This, at the time that we created this, these were the top 10 Kentucky languages, and I really like the colors because it provides a friendlier look to the availability of services. So just to be perfectly transparent with you with this, this poster is pretty dated, and it was just one of the most friendly versions I had seen at the time, and it would need to be redone. Luckily, we can rely on our language assistance provider to be able to provide other written versions of this poster with languages that are a little more common in Kentucky now. So, for example, French isn't on this list. Arabic isn't on this list, and there's a couple of others that did not make it on this list. So it really is time for us to redo it. It's just hard for me to let go of it since it's so pretty and colorful and hopefully a little bit welcoming. So the biggest question becomes, when do we need to use an interpreter? And oftentimes this is seen as a really big judgment call or a question of judgment. And I know that I prefer, whenever possible, to have a checklist so that I can assure that I am doing all the right things. And I think it just helps set us up for success if we can figure out when we're doing the right things. Or so often, our work is done by judgment and by hoping we did the best and by guided by great intentions. But it would really be nice sometimes to have a checklist to check and say, yes, I'm on the right track. And believe it or not, when it comes to language accessibility, we actually do have a bit of a checklist. So I often ask, when do we use an interpreter? And I get an array of questions or examples of when this would be. Unfortunately, those answers are usually pretty subjective. So the reality is that we need an interpreter when people cannot read, write, or understand the English language or the language that their client speaks at a level that permits them to interact effectively with providers. Granted, that is not a very definitive definition or guidance, but it is incredibly clear about what we're looking for and when we need to provide an interpreter. And at the end of the day, as in culturally competent practice mode, we can definitely understand that providing an interpreter is culturally competent practice. And if we do not speak a language that allows us as service providers to interact effectively with the people who need our services and support, then we should be providing an interpreter. This isn't a judgment call. It's not a maybe. It's if people can't read, write, or speak the language at a level that permits them to interact effectively or that allows us to interact effectively, then we will all be better served by having an interpreter available. People who request an interpreter. This idea that people may speak more than they may understand more than they speak, or speak more than they understand. those are pretty big judgment calls that probably won't result in the best outcomes in terms of building rapport and establishing trusting relationships with people who are um, seeking our services. And it's important to remember that language proficiency decreases in crisis. Um, According to some of the English or language acquisition articles that I've read, it takes about 150 hours of instruction for someone to become or to be a basic learner of another language or to begin to acquire a language. It takes about 500 hours of instruction for someone to be an intermediate learner. And it takes about 1,500 hours of instruction for someone to become fluent in another language. Many of us have taken language classes in college or in high school, and even though I'm a native Spanish speaker, it was the hardest class I ever had because it wasn't the language that I spoke on a daily basis. Um, and I would say that some of your experiences have probably been similar in trying to acquire a language. If we keep, if we think about this, the average American works about 2,080 hours a year. That's 40 hours a week, or 40 hours a week for the say 50 weeks a year if we don't count vacations. That's about 2,080 hours a year, and that is amounts to about having to spend 9 months of about 40 hours a week acquiring a second language in order to become fluent in that language. Many of the people that we work with do not have the luxury of being able to invest that kind of time in acquiring a language specifically or exclusively devoting their time to that. So, what ends up happening is that people begin to acquire the language simply by being around it and being immersed in it, and most often at work, because that's where we spend the majority of our time. By acquiring it this way, what happens is that people learn vocabulary that is centered around words they use most often, language that they use most often, and expressions that are used most often in their work. And so it's important to remember that because then we would also remember that essentially a crisis means a new situation. And people don't always have the language necessary to be able to function in new situations as effectively as they might in familiar situations. So when we talk about language proficiency decreasing in crisis, this can mean as simple as out of my normal environment without the inclusion of violence. And so when we have people who reach out to us for services because they've experienced violence in their lives, they may not just be experiencing one crisis. They might be in multiple crises. One, because it's a new situation, new people, new vocabulary, and then secondarily, the violence that has happened. And so language proficiency is going to decrease, and it will be even more important to be able to provide an interpreter to ensure that you are able to capture as much of the information as someone can provide to you. And at the end of the day, when in doubt, call an interpreter. I mean, this is just, I cannot stress this enough. It is much, much better. It is trauma informed. It is culturally competent. It is non discriminatory to have an interpreter. It will do wonders for your rapport and for establishing those relationships and ensuring that people trust us as they access our services. And given that this may affect many immigrant families and immigrant communities, I cannot stress enough the impact that you'll be making by demonstrating your commitment to ensuring access to services in a non discriminatory way. So, next up, it would be relevant materials. What does this mean? It's including but not limited to any documents requiring the signature of the survivor or client. Those regarding expectations, rights, and responsibilities. Signage and documents are a part of trauma informed care. So we should invest our trauma-informed lens in what it means to serve people who have limited English proficiency or who may not speak English as their first language. And when I say this, I don't mean it to sound very privileged, as in just make everything multiple languages. This is not does not have to be done in its entirety all at once or without regard for what kind of financial requirement this will mean for an organization. This could be something that's done over time. Or not all of our programs have multilingual materials. This can be done um, in small batches, focusing on the really important things, maybe the materials that require signatures, or maybe the materials that are going to increase visibility. So this requires a little bit of thought to be able to engage in this process in a meaningful, intentional, and also fiscally responsible way. You may not need all of your brochures to be translated into 162 different languages. Maybe you need 3 languages because those are the communities that exist in your service area. And granted, this may change over time. As I mentioned with our poster, we have outgrown our poster because in an area that had 10 top languages, schools report 190 different languages being spoken. So this will change, and it's perfectly okay if you outgrow some of these things. Skilled staff. What this means is that you invest and develop the skills of staff so that they can be empowered and expected to know how and be empowered to access language services or language resources. This could include telephone interpreters, live interpreters, video remote interpreters. Um, we use video remote interpreters mostly for certified ASL interpreters. Um, they should be empowered to and expected to advocate on behalf of survivors for their accessibility with partner agencies. This could include courts, police, etc. Many of our court advocates often tell us how their adventures fare when they have to take someone to obtain a protective order and the court clerk may not be familiar with their language services process. Often what they will do is that they will take out their work issued phone and call a language line on their behalf and just make sure that the survivor has access to the information and the services that they need. Then what they'll do is they'll go back and then talk to that court staff individually about what options exist for them and the availability of their internal resources to be able to provide this service. As the Coalition Office, we have obtained a copy of the language accessibility policies and practices from the Administrative Office of the Courts and provided them to our member program so that they are familiar with what can be expected of court staff. And you can do this with other organizations that you find yourself working with. It could be police, it could be health departments. Really, it's a matter of understanding what it is that you might need to ask for or look for. Staff should also be empowered and expected to understand their own biases and work to eliminate those assumptions and stereotypes from affecting service provision. So basically, investing in intersectionality and anti-oppression skills would be a huge help in making sure that staff are prepared to respond to the needs of non-English speakers or limited English proficient people. They should educate themselves to encourage connection and acceptance. And they should be able to apply the principles of cultural competency as in terms of innocence, worthiness, and competence in interactions. I didn't talk a lot about this earlier, but in Kentucky, we understand cultural competency to be the provision of the 3 presumptions: the presumption of innocence, the presumption of worthiness, and the presumption of competence. Innocence being that survivors or people who seek our services are not the source of the problem and deserve the benefit of the doubt. That people are competent enough to participate in their own human experience and capable of making their own decisions for themselves and their families, and that they are worthy of time, energy, resources, and investment. When I said earlier that providing language accessible services was an act or was a culturally competent practice, this is what I was referencing. Um, an advocate who complies with their language accessibility policy is specifically deciding through proactivity that the person before them, the non-English person before them, is worthy of their time to seek out an interpreter, worthy of the organization's resources, and worthy of an investment of making of an organization making an investment in figuring out how to deliver services in a way that can be accessible for survivors who may not look like us or may not speak like us. This framework came from an article by an educator at the University of Oregon. Her name is Chris Cullinan, and she wrote an article called "Innocence or Vision, Privilege, and the Limits of Tolerance." And it's one of the best articles we have ever read, and it's so helpful for us. Kentucky is not as racially diverse as other states might be. And so this is a really good way to be able to have this conversation where people can find tangible steps that they can take to be able to be culturally competent. As we all, I'm sure, have struggled with how to make cultural competency a digestible, actionable, practicable concept for people without perpetuating additional stereotypes or biases. The fourth part of meaningful access is to provide um, a process for training and monitoring. Training, these are just my suggestions for you, but training can include, I gave you some specific ideas about things you could consider as you work to develop your own process for ensuring that your services are language accessible and non-discriminatory. So training, at least at KCADV, this is what it might look like. We have a yearly training for staff to be able to understand what our internal processes are for making a phone call that would include an interpreter. We provide some of that skills training. That also can include including language internal processes for each program to train staff to use LanguageLine. It can be training specific to serving underserved populations. It can be training via certification processes or trauma informed curriculum. So these are all examples that are currently happening in Kentucky. So what we've done is incorporated and integrated language accessibility into just about any kind of training that KCADV or our member programs offer. It is built into the fabric of service provision at KCADV and its member programs. With regard to monitoring, this is how we monitor our programs in a variety of different ways. We have an underserved population survey report. We have a CHFS monitoring tool and process by which we visit all of the domestic violence programs and we review their language access policy and we make sure that they're providing notice. We request information about what materials they have and about practice as well. We also, CHFS is the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. Since we're a pass-through agency, we are required to also be the monitoring agency for those 15 programs, and this is the process in which language accessibility monitoring is included. Additionally, we are also a VOCA monitoring agency for our member programs, and so we utilize a similar tool that also includes language accessibility. The other thing to note is that we have engaged in some what we call administrative lobbying and our executive lobbying, which means that we have lobbied to change the way granting programs are reviewed. And so, for example, one of our biggest successes was that to is that now the language accessibility policy is required for the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet application for funding. This includes our VOCA funding. This includes our STOP funding. This includes really any funding that comes through the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. And so this was a huge win because this meant that every single domestic violence program has to have a language accessibility policy. This doesn't speak to the quality of that policy and procedure, but it was enough to get started, to start with something. We can provide technical assistance around the quality as we go forward, but the hardest part was getting even the quantity to be at least one. So we have since incorporated a language access policy requirement for the Cabinet for Health and Family Services funding that is subcontracted through our organization. Monitoring, though, can be, and training can both be internal processes. They don't have to be external, as I've talked about with our organization. They can be internal to yours. Starting somewhere is really the most important part. The more you do it, the better you'll become, and the more practice you'll get, and the higher your standards will become. So, and I'm always happy to share additional examples. Elements of a policy and procedure will likely include the expectation that staff will work effectively to provide non-discriminatory services. The expectation that management staff will be fully aware of and understand the plan so that they can reinforce its importance, and expectation to ensure its implementation by all staff. It will also include an identification of people who need your services. Who do you commit to serving? How have you identified them? What have you assessed to be able to decide where you'll start? The ways in which accommodations will be provided will you be using live interpreters? Will you be using volunteer interpreters? Will you be using a combination? Will you be using video remote interpreting? And being able to provide multiple avenues for being able to access some of those. The types of accommodations available and how staff can obtain these services and accommodations. A common training for us is teaching people how to be able to make a three-way call. It was really interesting because at the beginning of this work for us, it was basically the biggest challenge is that people just didn't know how to make a three-way call to be able to include an interpreter in their phone call. A policy and procedure will likely also include how to respond to survivors. We included information about cultural competency. We expect that you will not treat survivors as if they're the source of the problem, or that they're not worthy of our time, energy, resources, and investment, or that they are not the experts in their own experiences and can be trusted to make their own decisions. It can also include information about what should be documented. For example, the use of an interpreter, a specific interpreter that was used, the language spoken by someone. You should also talk about how you'll provide training for staff. Will you do this on a yearly basis? Will you do this at new employee orientation? Will you provide this at your conference? How will you do this? How you will provide notice? How are you going to let the community, allied partners, allied professionals, members of the community who might need your services that you are available to serve them? How you will monitor service quality and provision. How will you monitor your organization and your staff's response to non-English speakers? How do you plan to update your plan, policies, and procedures? We rewrote a draft or a template policy in which we built it in and said that once a year, the emergency services supervisor or the executive director or the training person are going to be responsible for reviewing the plan and requesting input from staff or others to be able to inform any changes that might need to be made or updates that need to be taken into consideration. The other thing to be aware of is something called the four-factor analysis. So a minute ago, or a little bit ago, I spoke about the fact that you don't have to translate every single piece of paper that your organization uses to function into every single language in existence. That you can be judicious in how you do this, or be intentional and have a plan for being able to respond to this need. Um, the process by which you do that or can do that could be the four-factor analysis. This means that you can take into consideration the number or proportions of people eligible to be served or likely to be encountered by the federally funded program. The frequency with which individuals would come into contact with the program, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or services provided by the program to people's lives, and the resources available to the grantee and recipient and costs. So, the expense of providing language accessible services is not a defense for not providing them. However, you can have a nuanced consideration of what it will cost and be able to make nuanced decisions based on what resources you have available to you. So, with regard to the four-factor analysis, for example, if you live in a city that has 5,000 people and 2,500 people speak Spanish, it would make sense that you would translate the majority of your documents or anything that needs to be signed or many of your client-facing materials into Spanish. But let's say that Russian is not a language that's spoken in your community. You would not have to invest in Russian materials across your organization simply because one person needs them. We do need to make those services accessible, and you may decide that you want to be prepared and want to invest in that, but it would be understandable that you would not have those pre-prepared or that you would have exactly the same accommodations for everyone. The nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program to people's lives. This comes into account for us. We plan for accessibility a little bit differently, for example, for our annual conference than we do for our direct services. Because in terms of importance, yes, participation is absolutely important. Um, but perhaps the expense that is incurred looks different at our conference than it would at our local domestic violence programs. So this is one of the things I'm really excited about sharing with you because I mentioned that when I was hired at KCADV, this was in 2002, so it's been a little while. We didn't have access to interpreters in similar ways, and this made a world of difference for us. Um, the top is about 2 years ago. And when I was first hired at KCADV, I did some preliminary research to try to figure out what resources our programs had available to them. At the time, I discovered, it was in 2004, I discovered that only the three major programs in Kentucky, located in our most urban areas, actually had access to language services. And what this meant is that they had contracts with LanguageLine. The problem with those contracts was that unless you were lucky enough to live in Lexington, Louisville, or Bowling Green, you might not, or Cincinnati, you might not have access to an interpreter and might be sort of on your own for a while. And secondly, in addition to limitations of geography, there's also limitations of funding. Those programs were better equipped to account for that need in their budgets. And even still, they paid something like $3.54 a minute for Spanish on a Tuesday. And so it was really difficult because they were sort of on their own financially. So in 2004, KCADV engaged in an attempt to be able to provide our member domestic violence programs with some help on this area. KCADV provided leadership to be able to create what is called our umbrella account. We worked with Pacific Interpreters at the time. It has now become LanguageLine, and they gave us what was called a floating rate. And so what that meant was that the more minutes that were used, the lower the rate could be. And so it also allowed us to not have a contract at each of our domestic violence programs. This meant that the smaller programs were able to have access to interpreters on a 24/7 basis without having to pay for simply having the service available. If they didn't use it, they didn't pay for it. And so what that meant is that it was more affordable and more accessible to the programs themselves. And so they were more likely to use it simply because they had it. So in addition to that, the smaller programs who used it less were able to contribute to the minutes of the bigger programs who used it more. And by pooling their minutes, they therefore reduced the rate of the programs that were using it more. And so it became a really cool way for them to be able to help each other and be able to increase accessibility. The programs were responsible specifically for paying for their own expenses. The coalition never invested very concertedly in making sure that they pay for their access. Um, Almost since the beginning, the domestic violence programs in our state have been responsible for their parts or their bills to LanguageLine. Additionally, about 2 years ago or so, we began trying to update and provide some technical assistance as part of our agreement with our VOCA funding to provide technical assistance around language accessibility. And so we created a draft language accessibility plan and sent it to our programs. Now, of course, before we did that, we did an assessment of where they were with each of their plans. Because they submitted to us for monitoring purposes, we had all of their language access plans on file. So we conducted an audit of each of their plans, which is the top half of the screen you'll see. And I went through each of them and created a matrix of what were we going to be monitoring for in each of their plans, what would we be looking for. And it was based on the elements of meaningful access and the elements of what is likely to be included in what is considered a good language access plan. And so as you can see, they were kind of okay, but really not. There was a lot of red. And so it was interesting to see. I was glad to see that the green was there, but there was still a lot of red. Now, if you look at the bottom, you can see how big of a difference it made to provide them with with that technical assistance and what it can look like now. Our programs are now monitored based on the bottom half of the screen, and that's what their language access plans look like. A few of them, as you can see, still need a little help and still need a little TLC or a little technical assistance. But overwhelmingly, you see that as an entire system, there's a lot more green than there is red or orange. And it makes me really proud to be able to see that kind of a difference and that kind of investment in a non-English speaking population or serving non-English speaking survivors or people who have a limited English proficiency. And so it's really, really wonderful to see. And I'm glad that I've gotten to be around as long as I have to be able to see that transition, that we can start to look at the quality of their policies and the quality of their practices rather than whether or not they have any of these things visible, available, or accessible. And so I'm really proud of our programs, but as I can tell you, it says what a difference a plan makes and what a difference a year might make or 2 years might make. But don't forget that at the end of the day, I cannot stress enough how much of a journey this is and has been. I'm fortunate enough that I was with the coalition since 2002, and this has been primarily my work and primarily my focus. And so for me to see as much green as is at the bottom of your screen, I think is a testament to our member programs to be able to um, steady steadily but surely make progress toward um, the best work they can do. So I look forward to being able to see where we can go next year. Look forward to the time where those will all be green, and that maybe we can start looking at what does, yes, they have a fantastic plan. Now let's talk about their practice, and let's start monitoring from different, more sophisticated aspects. So I hope that this gives you a little bit of a sense of how many places you can make a difference and how many places you can integrate language accessibility and the reasons why and the law behind the requirement, um, and also the places where it might take a little while. So should you ever have any questions, I would be happy to provide you with any kind of materials that we created to support our work in this, give you my feedback or my thoughts. You know, I'm happy to share some of the best practices that well ended up being best practices for us that we learned. We have the benefit of 17 years worth of hindsight. So I can tell you now what things might have been different, could have taken less, or might have been more helpful. And so or what worked really, really well. So if there's ever anything I can do to share with you, anything I can do to support you, or information I can share with you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I am happy to help, and I recognize that any investment in supporting member programs anywhere or programs anywhere they may be really will result in better services to survivors. And at the end of the day, that's really why we all do this. So whatever we can do to be supportive, we want to try to do. Thank you so much for your time and for spending this last hour or so with me. And I hope we'll be in touch. Thanks so much.